It was late 1943, and the skies over Europe were burning. The US 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than it could replace them. Every mission deep into Germany meant dozens of men never coming home. The Luftwaffe's deadly Bf-109s and FW-190s tore through the bomber formations, and no Allied fighter could escort them all the way. The P-47 Thunderbolt was fast, the Spitfire was agile, but neither could make it to Berlin and back. In hangars across England, frustration grew until one American engineer, working in near isolation, decided to break the rules. His name was Edgar Schmude, and he was tired of watching young pilots die. Schmude had been told to follow orders, to stick to approved designs, but he saw the writing on the wall. Germany was producing better planes, faster and deadlier each month. The Allies needed something revolutionary, not another prototype lost in paperwork. One night, as engines roared outside the North American Aviation plant, Schmude made a decision that would change the course of the air war. He took a rejected design, a sleek fighter with an experimental laminar flow wing, and began modifying it without permission. Mechanics whispered that he was crazy. Test pilots called it Schmude's gamble. Even senior officers dismissed it as impossible. But Schmude didn't stop. He added a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, an unapproved hybrid of American airframe and British engineering. When that plane finally took off, the world would never be the same again. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just fast, it was freedom on wings. It flew higher, faster and farther than anything the Luftwaffe could send against it. And soon, the very men who had laughed at Schmude's unapproved fix were watching their bombers return home safely for the first time in years. By the summer of 1943, the sky over Europe had become a graveyard of silver wings. Each morning, dozens of American bombers, massive B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, lifted off from airfields across England. Their mission, to cripple Nazi industry and bring the Reich to its knees. But by nightfall, most would never return. What began as proud formations of 100 aircraft often came back as scattered remnants, torn apart by German flak and the predatory claws of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The cold air at 20,000 feet became a corridor of death. Gunners froze in their turrets, radios went silent, and engines bled black smoke across the clouds. The Allies had the numbers, but Germany owned the air. Inside Allied command rooms, frustration festered. Charts on the walls told the truth. Losses were unsustainable. Every mission into central Germany meant dozens of crews lost. The bombers could fight, yes, but only when the enemy came close. Once the German fighters swarmed in with their cannons blazing, there was nothing but chaos and fire. What the Americans needed wasn't courage. They had that in abundance. What they needed was protection. They needed a fighter that could fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin, fight off the Luftwaffe, and bring those crews home. But no such plane existed. The British Spitfire could dance through dogfights, but couldn't cross the channel and still fight. The P-47 Thunderbolt had muscle, but drank fuel like water. And the P-38 Lightning, though powerful, struggled in Europe's cold, high-altitude conditions. It was a crisis that no one in Washington seemed able to solve. Engineers and bureaucrats argued over blueprints, proposals, and specifications. The airmen in England didn't have time for that. They watched their friends vanish in fireballs over Germany and wondered when, if ever, the tide would turn. But in a small corner of California, far from the European warfront, one man refused to accept that good enough was the limit. His name was Edgar Schmude, a German-born designer working for North American Aviation. He was not a soldier, not a general, not even a pilot of renown. But Schmude understood something that few did. The war in the air was about to be decided not by bravery, but by engineering. Schmude's desk was buried in drafts, sketches, and scale models. To him, the key to victory lay in the air itself, in how it moved over a wing, how resistance built and bled away, how the slightest curve could mean the difference between life and death. Where others saw specifications, he saw possibilities. He had studied German engineering, admired its precision, but he also saw its weaknesses, complexity, rigidity, an obsession with perfection that often ignored practicality. America's strength, he believed, lay in adaptability. So when the British came to North American Aviation, asking for a new fighter, Schmude didn't just design what they asked for. He designed what he knew the Allies needed, whether they realized it or not. The result was an unassuming blueprint labeled NA-73. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't officially prioritized, but its lines hinted at something new, something faster, sleeker, more efficient than anything in the skies. Schmidt's innovation was radical. A laminar flow wing, engineered to minimize drag by keeping airflow smooth across its surface. It was elegant in concept, but demanding in execution. The smallest flaw in production could destroy its advantage. When Schmidt presented the design, the response was polite skepticism. Too experimental, too risky, too different. But Schmidt didn't waver. He believed that this design, if built right, could give the Allies not just a fighter, but the fighter. When the first prototypes were assembled and tested, the Mustang, as it would later be called, immediately showed promise. It was agile, stable, and surprisingly fast for its size. Test pilots noted how it handled like no other plane they'd flown. But there was a catch. The Allison engine that powered it, though reliable, lacked performance at high altitude. It gasped for breath above 15,000 feet, well below the altitudes where bomber formations operated. To the U.S. Army Air Forces, that flaw was fatal. The Mustang, they said, would never be more than a low-altitude reconnaissance or ground attack aircraft. For Schmidt, it was a bitter moment. He had built a masterpiece, but it was being dismissed because of its heart, the engine. And yet deep down he knew the design itself was sound. It only needed the right power to unleash its full potential. Still, official orders were orders. The U.S. procurement system was rigid, and innovation often came second to procedure. The Mustang project was quietly sidelined. Schmidt was told to move on, but he didn't. He continued refining the design in his spare time, testing new modifications, studying flight reports. He spoke with pilots who flew the early Mustangs in British service and listened carefully. They loved its range, its visibility, its smooth handling. They just wanted more power. Schmidt began to imagine what might happen if that power could be found. Not from within American factories, but from across the ocean. While bureaucrats shuffled papers, young airmen continued to die. Every mission report from Europe came back soaked in the same language. Heavy losses, no escort beyond target, enemy fighters overwhelming. The pattern was unbreakable. And somewhere in California, a man with grease-stained hands and sleepless eyes stared at the shape of a wing and wondered why no one else could see what he saw, a solution hiding in plain sight. The Allied air campaign was reaching a breaking point. Without a breakthrough, without a miracle of engineering, the skies over Europe would remain under German control. But sometimes the greatest miracles don't come from orders, they come from defiance. And soon, that quiet defiance inside one engineer's mind would give birth to the most feared and admired fighter aircraft of the entire war. When Schmidt first saw the early production Mustangs lined up on the runway, he didn't see a finished product. He saw potential, a machine waiting to breathe properly. What he didn't yet know was that the answer to that breath, the spark that would make his creation unstoppable, was already humming inside another engine thousands of miles away in England. And when the two finally met, the laughter, the doubt, and the bureaucratic barriers would all burn away in the roar of a new legend, the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that would rule the skies and change the war forever. The early Mustang was a marvel of design, but it had one fatal flaw. Its heart was too weak for the war it had been born into. The Allison engine, dependable and steady, performed well at low altitudes, but over Europe the battles were fought in the freezing heights above 20,000 feet. There, where the air thinned and the horizon curved like a knife edge, the Mustang gasped for breath. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, ruled those skies, diving and climbing with terrifying freedom. The Mustang could not follow. It was fast but strangled by its own limitations. Pilots called it beautiful but suffocating. Commanders labeled it useful, but not strategic. And in military language, that was a death sentence. But among the British air officers who received their first shipment of Mustangs under the Lend-Lease program, there were whispers that this machine could be something extraordinary, if only someone dared to fix what official channels wouldn't. The Royal Air Force had an idea, one that bordered on heresy in both American and British bureaucratic circles. What if they replaced the Allison engine with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the legendary Spitfire? It was a gamble that most engineers dismissed as madness. The Merlin was powerful, yes, but it wasn't designed for the Mustang's frame. It ran hotter, demanded different cooling, and required reworking the entire nose structure of the plane. Officially, no one approved it. But in a small corner of an RAF testing airfield, a handful of British engineers working with quiet determination began the unapproved experiment anyway. Edgar Schmood knew about it. In fact, he encouraged it. He had seen what the laminar flow wing could do. All it needed was a heart that could match its potential. And that heart, he believed, beat inside the Merlin. The first tests were awkward, even dangerous. The airframe had to be rebalanced, the radiators re-engineered, and the cowl redesigned to fit the Merlin's longer profile. Mechanics worked through the night, improvising with spare parts and intuition. It was a mix of American metal and British fire, a partnership born not of diplomacy, but of desperation. When the modified Mustang finally rolled onto the tarmac, the men who had worked on it stood silent, watching. It looked familiar yet different, its stance more confident, its presence almost predatory. The test pilot climbed in, gave a small nod, and pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared to life with a deep guttural tone that no one had heard from a Mustang before. As it taxied down the runway and lifted into the grey English sky, something changed. The climb rate was astonishing. The roar of the Merlin echoed across the field, smooth and powerful. When the pilot banked and dived, the plane responded instantly, slicing through the air like a blade through silk. Every pass over the airfield drew stares of disbelief. The Mustang, once dismissed as a low-altitude scout, was now tearing through the sky at speeds that made seasoned flyers shake their heads in awe. After landing, the pilot climbed out, his face pale but smiling. "It's not a Mustang anymore," he said. "It's something else entirely." Within days, word spread through the Allied ranks. The unapproved modification had turned a struggling fighter into a phenomenon. The hybrid machine, an American body with a British soul, could climb faster, fly higher, and race farther than anything the Luftwaffe could field. It was as if the aircraft had been waiting for this exact union all along. When Schmood saw the test results, he knew instantly what it meant. The risk had paid off. The Mustang, when paired with the Merlin, had become something the war had not yet seen. A true long-range escort fighter, capable of flying from England to Berlin, engaging enemy fighters, and still having fuel to return home. It was the missing link, the key to unlocking the air war's stalemate. But there was one problem. It was still unofficial. The Army Air Forces hadn't sanctioned the modification. On paper, it didn't exist. Schmood and his allies in Britain pushed relentlessly. Reports, flight data, and performance charts flooded the desks of generals and procurement officers. For months, they argued that the Mustang's redesign could change the outcome of the bombing campaign. Finally, someone listened. In early 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces authorized production of the new version, the P-51 Mustang, powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was no longer an experiment. It was a revolution. When the first P-51Bs arrived in England, the pilots couldn't believe their luck. From the moment they sat in the cockpit and pushed the throttle, they knew this was a different breed of aircraft. The engine's whine at full power sent shivers through the airfield. The Mustang leapt forward, climbing effortlessly toward the clouds. Pilots who had flown Thunderbolts and Lightnings marveled at its grace. It felt alive. It felt invincible. The first combat missions confirmed what test flights had promised. Mustangs escorted bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany, places no Allied fighter had ever reached. Luftwaffe interceptors that had once feasted on unescorted bombers suddenly found themselves outmatched. The Mustang's speed and high-altitude power allowed it to dive into enemy formations with ruthless precision. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns shredded anything that crossed its path. For the men in the bombers, it was like waking from a nightmare. They could finally look out their windows over Germany and see protection. Sleek silver Mustangs flying wing to wing beside them, engines howling like thunder. Those who once braced for death now saw hope written in contrails across the sky. The Germans were stunned. Their intelligence reports had warned of a new Allied fighter, but no one believed it could be this fast, this lethal, this enduring. The Mustang could chase them all the way home, overrun their airfields and still make it back to England. It turned the hunters into the hunted, and somewhere back in America, Edgar Schmood smiled quietly. The plane they had called a failure, the low-altitude only experiment, had just rewritten the rules of air combat. His unapproved fix, the one that everyone had laughed at, had become the weapon that would help bring the Reich to its knees. The Mustang had found its heart. And with that heart it was ready to change the sky forever. When the new P-51B Mustang, powered by the Merlin engine, took to the skies over war-torn Europe, it wasn't just another aircraft, it was a revelation. For years, the Allies had struggled to protect their bomber fleets deep inside enemy territory. The strategy of daylight bombing, sending waves of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators into Germany, was bleeding the US Army Air Forces dry. Without fighter escorts capable of going the full distance, bomber losses had reached catastrophic levels. Crews knew that once they crossed into central Germany, the last friendly fighters would turn back, leaving them exposed to the Luftwaffe's lethal hunters. It was a stretch of air the men called the Black Gap. Every airman who flew through it understood what that meant. Squadrons left England with 10 planes and often returned with 5. Some didn't return at all. The Luftwaffe's elite pilots, men like Erich Hartmann and Walter Nowotny, dominated those skies in their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The bombers could only fly in tight formations and pray that sheer numbers would protect them. It didn't. By 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing hundreds of men in single missions. Morale was low. The dream of strategic bombing breaking Germany's will was slipping away. Then, out of the grey winter clouds, something new appeared. A sleek, silver shape flying in perfect formation with the bombers, its wings long and elegant, its engine roaring with a deep, steady confidence. The Mustangs had arrived. At first, the Luftwaffe didn't know what they were facing. German pilots had seen plenty of American fighters before, the Thunderbolts, the Lightnings, but none behaved like this. The P-51 could dive faster than any German aircraft and still climb away with ease. It could roll, bank and turn with astonishing precision, responding to the lightest touch. Even the sound of its Merlin engine was different, a smooth, rising howl that filled the air like a promise. For the bomber crews, the effect was immediate and emotional. In the bitter cold at 20,000 feet, where the wind screamed through gun ports and the oxygen masks froze to their faces, they looked out and saw the Mustangs holding formation beside them. Their presence was a silent reassurance. You're not alone anymore. One tail gunner later recalled, "The first time I saw a Mustang outside my window over Germany, I cried. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally believed I might live to see home again." The Mustang's long-range capability was its true miracle. Thanks to drop tanks and the efficiency of the Merlin engine, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, over 1,000 miles round trip. This changed everything. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's favorite hunting grounds were no longer safe. The German pilots, once confident in their dominance, found themselves chased down even after breaking off attacks. The hunters had become the prey. In the first major missions with Mustang escorts, results were staggering. Bomber losses dropped dramatically. Air combat reports described entire Luftwaffe formations being ripped apart by P-51 squadrons before they could even reach the bombers. American pilots, once forced into defensive combat, now sought out the enemy. They called it bringing the fight home. One of the most iconic units to fly the Mustang was the 4th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Debden Eagles. Many of its pilots were seasoned veterans. Some had fought in the Battle of Britain. When they transitioned to the P-51, their kill ratio skyrocketed. In March 1944, the 4th took part in the first full-length escort mission to Berlin. As the bomber streams crossed the German capital, Luftwaffe fighters rose to intercept, but they never stood a chance. The Mustangs cut through them like lightning, engaging every wave that approached. By the end of the day, Allied Air Command reported one of the lowest bomber loss rates of the entire campaign. The Black Gap was gone. The Germans tried to adapt, though they threw everything they had, new tactics, new aircraft like the FW-190D and the Me-410. But it was too late. The Mustang was everywhere. Even the feared Me-262 jet fighter, though faster, couldn't escape the P-51's aggression during takeoff and landing. American pilots learned to attack the jets as they returned to base, catching them vulnerable on the runways. Every sortie cost Germany aircraft they could no longer afford to lose. But beyond statistics and dogfights, what truly defined the Mustang's rise was the spirit it gave to the men who flew it. Pilots spoke about the aircraft as if it were alive, responsive, loyal, even empathetic. One flyer said, "The Mustang didn't just fly, it understood you. If you treated her right, she'd bring you home." The cockpit visibility was unmatched, the controls smooth and precise, and the power under the throttle intoxicating. For the first time, American fighter pilots felt they had an aircraft that didn't just compete with the Luftwaffe, it surpassed them. Over the next months, the P-51 spearheaded the Allied air offensive. Its range allowed fighters to escort bombers beyond the Rhine, deep into the industrial heartland of the Reich. Oil refineries, rail lines, and factories that once operated under the illusion of safety now burned under relentless attacks. The Mustang was more than a weapon, it was a symbol of inevitability. Germany's air force, once the pride of the Third Reich, was bleeding out under the endless roar of those engines. In the skies over Europe, the balance of power had shifted. The bombers that once flew alone now moved in vast, protected formations, their silver escorts cutting graceful arcs around them like guardian angels. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and exhausted, began to lose not just planes, but faith. And for the men on the ground, those who loaded the bombs, those who fixed the planes, and those who waited for loved ones to return, the sound of the Merlin engine became something sacred. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of hope roaring through the clouds. The Mustang had not only saved the bombers, it had saved the air war itself. What began as an unapproved fix had turned into the weapon that would open the skies for the final push toward victory. In every contrail over Europe, in every gleaming wing that caught the morning light, the message was clear. The Allies had claimed the sky, and with it, the future. By the spring of 1944, the P-51 Mustang had proven itself in combat, sleek, powerful, and devastatingly effective. But it wasn't just the aircraft's engineering that made it legendary. It was the pilots, the men who climbed into that narrow cockpit, knowing every mission could be their last, who turned the Mustang from a machine into a symbol of dominance. Their daring, skill, and sometimes sheer recklessness transformed the tide of the air war. Among them were names that would become synonymous with courage: George Preddy, Don Gentile, John C. Meyer, Bud Anderson, men who understood that the Mustang wasn't just built to fly, it was built to hunt. In the skies over France and Germany, those pilots became part of a deadly chess game. The Luftwaffe, though bloodied, still had its aces, and the Germans weren't about to surrender control of the air easily. The introduction of the P-51 into escort missions meant that the balance had shifted, but it also meant the dogfights had grown fiercer than ever. On a cold morning in April 1944, Major George Preddy and his squadron of Mustangs lifted off from Bodney Airfield in England. Their mission: escort a formation of B-17 flying fortresses striking rail yards near Hanover. The sky was thick with vapor trails, sunlight glinting off the bombers' wings. Everything seemed calm until the German fighters appeared. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s roared out of the clouds in coordinated waves. The air filled with the crack of machine guns, the streaks of tracer fire, and the booming chaos of explosions. Preddy dove his Mustang straight into the fray. The P-51's high-altitude performance gave him the edge. He could climb faster, turn sharper, and dive harder than the enemy. Within seconds, he lined up behind a Messerschmitt, squeezed the trigger, and the 650 caliber Browning machine guns roared to life. The German fighter burst into flames and spiraled downward. Without hesitation, Preddy pulled into another attack, taking down a second plane before the first had even hit the ground. From the bombers below, the crewmen watched in awe as the Mustangs weaved through enemy formations. "They looked like hawks among pigeons," one B-17 gunner later said. "You could see the German planes breaking apart, smoking, falling. Those Mustangs were everywhere at once. You almost forgot how scared you were." It wasn't only skill. It was the Mustang's design that gave pilots like Preddy such confidence. The visibility from the cockpit was unmatched. The bubble canopy offered an unobstructed view of the sky. No more blind spots or awkward angles. A Mustang pilot could see danger coming and react in seconds. And with its long-range fuel tanks, he didn't have to worry about running out of power just when the battle reached its peak. As Allied bombers pushed deeper into Germany, Mustang pilots began flying fighter sweeps, missions specifically designed to seek and destroy enemy aircraft, even before they could reach the bombers. They roamed the skies in pairs or small groups, covering airfields, rail lines, and troop convoys. The Luftwaffe's own pilots soon began to dread the distant, haunting hum of the Merlin engine. That sound meant the hunters were near. One of the most dramatic confrontations came during the Big Week Offensive in February 1944, a massive Allied effort to cripple Germany's aircraft production. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the fight. Over 2,000 German fighters were scrambled to repel the bombers. But the Mustangs were waiting for them. The sky turned into a swirling chaos of vapor trails, burning engines and parachutes drifting through smoke. The Americans shot down hundreds of enemy planes in a single week. German industry suffered crippling losses, but worse, the Luftwaffe lost its veteran pilots, men who couldn't be replaced. Every mission came at a cost, though. For every victory, there was a pilot who didn't come home. The Mustang was fast, but it wasn't invincible. A burst of flak or a lucky German shot could tear through its thin aluminum skin. Many pilots went down behind enemy lines, captured or killed before they could be rescued. Yet despite the risks, morale remained high. They believed in their aircraft. They believed in the mission. And above all, they believed that they were changing the course of the war. The camaraderie among Mustang pilots became legendary. Between missions, they would gather in the briefing rooms, swapping stories over coffee and cigarettes, teasing each other about near misses and daring kills. They were young, most barely in their 20s, but they carried the weight of the war on their shoulders. Their bond with their aircraft was deeply personal. Some even gave their Mustangs names. Old Crow, PT2, the Hun Hunter. Each name painted in bold letters beneath the cockpit, a mark of pride and defiance. By the summer of 1944, the results were undeniable. The Mustang wasn't just escorting bombers, it was dominating the sky. The Luftwaffe was on the defensive, forced to fight over its own territory. German airfields were bombed daily, their runways cratered, their hangars burning. Every time they tried to scramble fighters, the Mustangs were waiting. What had once been the pride of Hitler's war machine, the invincible Luftwaffe, was now a shadow of its former self. But even as the tide turned, the pilots never lost their edge. They flew with the same intensity, the same precision, the same deadly grace that had brought them this far. They had seen too many comrades fall to take victory for granted. For them, every flight was a balance between survival and sacrifice. As one pilot wrote in his diary, "Up there it's just you, the sky, and your Mustang. When you push that throttle forward and feel her surge beneath you, there's nothing like it. You're not just flying, you're free. And in that freedom you fight for every man who never made it back." The Mustang pilots weren't just escorting bombers, they were escorting the future. Every mission they flew brought the Allies one step closer to the end of the war. And as the sun set over the airfields of England, their planes lined up on the tarmac, battered, scarred but unbroken, ready to rise again into the darkening sky. By late 1944, the Mustang had become more than just a fighter. It was a legend written across the skies of Europe. Yet behind that legend were men who lived every moment with the awareness that their next sortie could be their last. The unapproved fix that had once been mocked had now become the backbone of Allied air power, and every German pilot who faced a Mustang in the sky knew it. But the fight wasn't over. Germany was desperate, its forces cornered, and its air command clinging to the last threads of hope. In the bitter winter of 1944, that desperation took form in one final, brutal offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and once again, the P-51 Mustang would prove that innovation, courage, and sheer willpower could change the fate of nations. The Ardennes was frozen in silence when it began. Snow blanketed the forests, muffling every sound except the distant rumble of engines. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched a surprise counter-offensive through the dense woods of Belgium and Luxembourg, striking at the heart of thin American lines. Hitler's goal was audacious: split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into peace talks. It was a gamble, One last desperate roll of the dice. Caught off guard, American units were overwhelmed. Fuel depots were destroyed, communication lines severed, and the icy roads choked with retreating vehicles. The overcast skies, heavy with clouds, grounded Allied aircraft. For the first few days, the US Army fought blind and cold, without the protection of the skies they had long relied on. But when the weather broke, everything changed. The fog lifted, and with it came the roar of hundreds of engines. The P-51 Mustangs, along with Thunderbolts and Typhoons, surged into the air. The skies that had hidden the German advance now betrayed them. Convoys, tanks, and supply lines that had been invisible beneath the snow were suddenly exposed to the wrath of the Allied air forces. For the pilots of the Mustangs, it was a grim, relentless task. They strafed columns of vehicles crawling through narrow forest roads, their .50 caliber guns tearing through armor and fuel trucks alike. Flames lit up the snow, black smoke twisting into the pale sky. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, sending up what few aircraft they had left, but the Mustangs were waiting. One of those pilots was Lieutenant James "Red" Parker, a quiet young man from Kansas who'd flown more than 60 missions by then. On the morning of December 24th, his squadron received orders to target German troop concentrations near St. Vith. As they approached the area, Parker spotted movement, a convoy of half-tracks and trucks snaking through the woods. He called it out over the radio, voice calm but sharp, and peeled into a dive. The wind screamed around his canopy as he leveled out at treetop height, tracer rounds flashing ahead of him. The first truck erupted in an orange fireball. The second shattered under a burst of gunfire. By the time he climbed back to altitude, the road below was a line of flame. The other Mustangs followed, their attacks coordinated and merciless. Within minutes, what had been an organized retreat turned into chaos. German soldiers abandoned vehicles, diving into ditches or running into the woods. On the ground, survivors described the attack as terrifying, unstoppable. They came out of the sun, one captured German officer recalled later. The sound of those engines, it was like thunder. You could not fight it. You could only hide and pray. For the Americans on the ground, those same engines meant salvation. The tide of the Battle of the Bulge began to shift. Air superiority had once again become the deciding factor, but even victory in the air came with a cost. The cold was brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and pilots returning from missions often had frostbitten fingers. The mechanics who maintained the aircraft worked day and night in the open, their hands raw from the wind. And for every Mustang that landed, another didn't. When pilots failed to return, their names were quietly marked off the board in the squadron room, replaced by a new call sign, a new mission, another sortie. There was no time to mourn, not yet. The Battle of the Bulge dragged on for weeks, and through it all the P-51s flew tirelessly. When fuel was low, they risked forced landings on icy fields. When ammunition ran dry, they turned for home through flak and gunfire. They became the eyes and claws of the Allied army, scouting, intercepting, destroying. And every mission reaffirmed what the skeptics back in 1942 had refused to believe: that a fast, lightweight fighter, built with ingenuity and a dash of rebellion, could outfly and outfight the best the Axis powers could muster. As January dawned and the German offensive faltered, the Mustangs continued their work, chasing the retreating enemy back across the Rhine. The skies that had once been ruled by Messerschmitts now belonged entirely to the Allies. For men like Red Parker, the war had entered its final act, but there was no celebration, no feeling of triumph, just exhaustion, relief, and the endless hum of the engines that had carried them this far. Parker would later write in his journal, "Every time I looked down and saw the wreckage, I thought of what this plane has done. She's more than metal and bolts. She's freedom. She's the reason those men on the ground can fight another day." That sentiment was echoed across airfields in France, England, and Belgium. The Mustang wasn't just a machine. It was the embodiment of a belief that courage and creativity could triumph over fear and conformity. By the end of the winter campaign, the Luftwaffe had been effectively broken. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered as Germany's last stand, and the P-51 Mustang had helped ensure it would also be their final defeat in the air. The unapproved fix, the bold decision that had once been laughed at, had reshaped the course of aerial warfare forever. And every time a Mustang's shadow passed over the snow, it carried a message. that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat lies in the courage to defy expectations. By April 1945, the war in Europe was almost over. The Allies were closing in on Berlin, and what was left of the German war machine was crumbling under the relentless pressure from land and air. The P-51 Mustang, once dismissed as an experimental gamble, was now the undisputed ruler of the skies. Its pilots had become legends, its engines roar a promise of liberation and vengeance. But even in the war's final days, the missions didn't stop. The danger hadn't vanished. Every pilot knew that the last battles were often the most unpredictable, when an enemy cornered by defeat fought hardest. At a small airfield in France, Major Robert Hawk Leland prepared for what might be his final mission. The target was simple but symbolic, a series of railway yards near Regensburg, one of the last arteries feeding the retreating German forces. Intelligence suggested that a handful of Messerschmitt 262 jet fighters, the Luftwaffe's last desperate innovation, had been seen in the area. If true, the mission could turn deadly fast. The 262s were faster than any propeller-driven plane alive, capable of outrunning even the Mustang in level flight. But the Americans had learned their weakness. The jets were slow to climb and fragile on takeoff and landing. Catch them in those moments, and even the mighty Me-262 could be brought down. As the sun rose over the horizon, golden light reflecting off the frost-covered tarmac, the squadron of Mustangs thundered down the runway, their engines roaring in unison. Leland's call sign crackled over the radio. Silver One Airborne. His voice was calm, steady, the tone of a man who had flown too many missions to be rattled by one more. Above him, the contrails stretched across the clear morning sky, a silent testament to the countless flights before this one. They crossed into Germany, with little resistance at first. The rail yard below looked quiet, almost peaceful. Then in an instant it erupted. Flak bursts filled the sky, black puffs of smoke blossoming like deadly flowers. Shrapnel pinged against the Mustang's fuselage, a sharp metallic sound that made the hair rise on Leland's neck. He pushed the stick forward, diving low. The rails rushed beneath him as he lined up his sights. A convoy of fuel cars came into view. He pressed the trigger, and the Mustang's guns spat fire. A moment later, the entire line of cars exploded, sending a column of flame hundreds of feet into the air. But then the radio crackled with panic. Bandits! 2 o'clock high. Jets! Leland snapped his head up. Out of the clouds streaked 2 Me-262s, their silver wings gleaming in the sunlight. They moved like ghosts, fast, smooth, terrifying. In seconds they were on the Mustangs, their cannons spitting bright streams of tracer rounds. One of Leland's wingmen, Lieutenant Harris, didn't even have time to react before his Mustang was hit. The plane shuddered, then broke apart, trailing smoke as it spiraled toward the ground. Leland's instincts took over. "Brake left! Stay low!" he ordered. The key was to force the jets down, make them maneuver where their speed couldn't help them. He dove toward the trees, the ground rushing up beneath him. The 262 followed, trying to line up a shot. But at that altitude, the Mustang's agility was unmatched. Leland pulled hard on the stick, feeling the strain of gravity press against his chest. The German jet overshot him, flashing by like a streak of lightning. That was the opening. Leland rolled inverted, dove again, and opened fire. The tracers found their mark. The 262's right engine erupted in flames. It banked wildly before crashing into a forested ridge below. The second jet tried to escape, climbing for altitude, but the rest of Leland's squadron was already converging. They fired in unison, tearing through its tail. It burst into smoke, then disappeared into the clouds. The radio was silent for a moment. Then Leland's voice came through, quiet but firm. "All bandits down. Let's head home." When they returned to base, the ground crews gathered to greet them. The airmen climbed from their cockpits, exhausted but alive. 2 planes were missing. 2 friends who would never return. For a long moment, no one spoke. The war was nearly over, but its cost still weighed heavy in the air. A few weeks later, the news spread like wildfire. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and Germany had surrendered. Across Europe, people celebrated in the streets. But for the Mustang pilots, the victory felt different. There was relief, yes, but also an emptiness that came when the purpose that had driven them suddenly vanished. The hangars were filled with silent aircraft, wings glinting in the fading light. their propellers still for the first time in years. Major Leland wrote in his journal that night, "The skies are quiet now. I should be happy. But when I look at that Mustang, the same one that's brought me back from hell more times than I can count, I wonder if she feels it too." The silence, the absence of purpose. She was built to fight, to fly. And now she waits just like us for what comes next. That sentiment echoed across every airfield from England to Italy. The war had ended, but the spirit of the Mustang, the boldness, the defiance, the sheer audacity of those who built and flew it, would never fade. The aircraft had done more than win dogfights. It had redefined aerial warfare. It had shown the world that innovation, even when dismissed or doubted, could turn the tide of history. In the years that followed, the P-51 Mustang became a symbol of American ingenuity and determination. Museums displayed it with reverence. Veterans visited its polished wings and told their children stories about the men who had laughed at impossible odds and then gone on to conquer the sky. And every time one of those old Merlins roared to life at an air show decades later, the crowd would fall silent, eyes lifting toward the heavens, remembering a time when the sound of that engine meant freedom, courage, and the end of tyranny. The Mustang had started as an unapproved experiment, a gamble dismissed by bureaucrats and skeptics alike. But by the end of World War II, it stood as the greatest fighter of its era, a machine that outflew, outgunned, and outlasted everything else in the air. It wasn't just a plane, it was a statement, proof that sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that change the world.